Social Psychology, Chapter 9, Prejudice, Disliking Others. In this chapter, we're going to look at the issues of prejudice and how social context can influence the development of prejudice and our tendency to dislike other people. So to start off, what is the nature and the power of prejudice? How would we define prejudice? Your text defines prejudice as a preconceived negative judgment of a group and its individual members. And so this preconceived notion tends to be supported by stereotypes, which are beliefs about the personal attributes of a person or a group. And so when you think about stereotypes, we think about these little shortcuts, these ways that we think about people and their attributes. Remember that we often make stereotypes. We make these shortcuts. We make these schemas that help us make sense out of a lot of information so that we don't have to take time to think everything out step by step. And so by being able to come up with these stereotypes or these mental shortcuts, it helps us to make sense out of our world and to interact more efficiently with other people. The problem comes in when these stereotypes, though, are negative or when they're inaccurate and cause us to make some negative or inaccurate assumptions about people or groups of people. So when we think about prejudice, there are a couple of things that we typically associate with prejudice. One is discrimination. And so discrimination is an unjustified negative behavior toward a group or the members of a group. And so often when it comes to issues of discrimination, we think about someone who has power to withhold some type of privileges or rights or resources from an individual or group of individuals. Now, associated with discrimination, we often have the issue of racism. And racism is a prejudicial attitude or discriminatory behavior that's toward a person of a given race. And kind of related to racism, we think about the concept of sexism. And sexism, very similar to racism, is going to be prejudicial attitudes and discriminatory behavior toward people of a given sex or a given gender. And so in both of these situations, we have the idea that there are these prejudicial attitudes that are going to be tied to a discriminatory behavior. And so it can lead to either racism, again, against a specific race, or sexism against a specific sex or gender. So now, as we think about prejudice, we want to think that prejudice can be implicit or can be explicit. And when we think about implicit, we think about an automatic type response. And so where we may not be consciously aware of it, we may not be actually thinking about it, but it's this automatic response that tends to be prejudicial. And then the explicit attitude tends to be more conscious. We tend to be more aware of those prejudicial feelings. Now, as we think about prejudice, and especially about racial prejudice, there's been debate over the years about how is racial prejudice changing, especially in American society. And so there's a question about, is racial prejudice actually disappearing in society? And so some of the studies that they've done looking at changes in views about racial prejudice have asked the question about, would you vote for a well-qualified black candidate whom your party nominated? And so, in our case, we can look at Obama and the fact that a lot of people would say yes. And so you think about, though, years ago in this study, they looked at how, like in the 50s and stuff, that a lot of people would have said no. But now that has changed quite a bit, so that you have a lot of people who are more likely to say, yes, if this is a qualified candidate, I don't care if he's black, or I'm not concerned with the color. I'm concerned more with the idea that this is a qualified candidate. And so some people look at that and say, well, the racism in America is dead or is disappearing, and there's some debate about that. So now, one of the issues though with saying that racism in America is disappearing or changing is the idea that racism today in some ways is seen in more subtle forms. And so you see more subtle forms of prejudice that may not be as out there, as obvious, as clear in your face as we would think about. So they think about things like labor market discrimination, which can be a more subtle form of prejudice. Patronization can be a more subtle form of prejudice. So you may have someone who works with women or with minorities. And so what they would do is that they may say, oh yeah, good job, good job. But then they don't really give you the resources to, to, to get better or to continue to improve. And so in that way, they can kind of hold you down so that you don't become more powerful or do better than they do. And so again, it may be a more subtle way. And so also part of patronization is the idea about avoiding criticism or even overpraising accomplishments. So again, you may praise accomplishments, but then you're not going to give the person the resources to continue to get better, because you want them to do some better. You want so there is some of that positive part, but then you don't want them to do so well that they may do better than you. So now, as we think about racial prejudice, and we think about the idea that some prejudice is considered to be automatic prejudice. And so when you think about automatic prejudice, we think about these primitive regions of your brain that tend to be associated with fear, or specifically the amygdala. And so they're looking at activity in that region in relation to people, and saying about how does that cause a person to just automatically respond in a prejudicial way. And so they've tried to look at things like looking at different races, and to say that for some people that they're going to react on a very automatic level against, say, black males, and that based on that you have this automatic prejudice, so that people may not consciously think about, I'm going to be prejudicial against a black male, but that seeing the black male invokes a certain amount of fear, and out of that fear you react, and that is the idea about the automatic prejudice. So now critics note that this unconscious associations may only indicate some very basic cultural assumptions, perhaps without prejudice. And so in looking at how in the culture, in many cultures, or in this culture, people have been conditioned, or there's some assumptions that are made about black males being more violent, being, that you need to be aware, be more on guard about them, because they may do something that would put you at risk. And so it causes you to become fearful of black males. And they've done studies that look at not just non-blacks, but also blacks have some of that same reaction. But again, some of the issue is, that there is there's a good bit of culture involved in having this response that people have to black males. And that when we say that it's an automatic response, it's still more of a conditioned response that has become somewhat automatic. Thinking about, we've talked about racial prejudice, but then there's also the issue of gender prejudice, and the idea that there are certain gender stereotypes that are out there. And so the idea that in America, as well in other parts of the world, there's still some strong gender stereotypes that exist. And as you deal with people in some of the developing countries, some of those stereotypes are even stronger, where in situations where females tend to be less power and have less power and be more oppressed. And so when you think about members of the stereotype group, often end up accepting some of these stereotypes. And so the idea about some of the self-fulfilling prophecy, when they take ownership of them and develop their identity around these stereotypes, then they're going to perpetuate those stereotypes. And so, you know, as they look at studies today, most people endorse that they believe that men and women are different but equal. But again, you still have some of the continued issues of females not being paid the same, females not having the same type of power, not being treated the same. And whether that's on a conscious or unconscious level, it still continues to exist. So, you know, when you think about this whole idea about sexism, um, some people say that attitudes towards women have changed and continue to change somewhat rapidly. So you can think about with the current elections idea that, you know, that right now the lead candidate for the Democratic Party is a woman. And so, you know, years ago that wouldn't happen. And so that shows in some ways that there's some changes. Um, but there's also the issue that most see women as being understanding, kind, and helpful, which really is a lot of the stereotypes about females. But then some of the research is saying, well, that some of this may be stereotypes about female qualities, but the research tends to suggest that those stereotypes do actually have some value and do actually tend to show up across cultures, that women are consistently considered more understanding, more kind, and more helpful. Now, some of that can lead to some gender discrimination. And so the idea that females are being discriminated against because of the female gender. And now they say that in Western countries that this discrimination tends to be disappearing. So the idea that is not as prevalent as it had been. There is a lot more equality. But you have to remember that in some of the non-Western countries, this gender bias is still very strong and is continuing. And so you may go into some of the developing countries where you see that women don't make as much money. Women don't have the powerful jobs, that the women tend not to be in the leadership roles, that the women tend to be the ones who are left to be single parents in a lot of places. And they're making a fraction of the money that the man would have to make, but they're also having to care for the children, making less money. And so you continue to see that. So now, as we think about some of the social inequalities and kind of think about how that relates to the unequal status and the prejudice, we've talked about it with women and we've talked about that with different racial groups. So there's a concept of social dominance orientation. And so basically what it talks about is that we're motivated to have one's own group dominate over other social group. So if we're in our group, we want our in group to be more powerful, to be better than the out group, that other group outside. And so the idea about being in a dominant high status position tends to promote this orientation of this social dominance, and it tends to justify it. And so you have some who talk about the idea that you know we deserve these special privileges and stuff because we are better than them. And so part of that tends to be an issue of, as we think about socialization and how are we socialized in ways that are going to promote this distinction of us and them, and this idea about prejudice. And so seeing how that socialization process contributes to that. And so one thing they talk about is working with authoritarian personalities. And that tends to be a personality that's disposed to favor obedience to authority and intolerance of outgroups or those lower in status. And so again, you know, the idea that we're going to follow authority, that outgroups are going to be bad, or anybody who has lower status than us is bad. And so we are the in group, we are the people who are in charge, and we deserve to be in charge. And so there's that whole concept of ethnocentricity. So the belief that our culture or our ethnicity is superior to all other groups, and that there's a certain amount of disdain or disrespect or devaluing of the other group because they are them, we are us, and we are better. So now, as you think about this process of socialization, your book talks about religion and socialization, or religion and prejudice. And so, to what extent do you think religion contributes to prejudice or socializing people to be prejudiced? Take a minute and think about it. Do you think that religion socializes people to be prejudiced? So now, in almost every country, leaders tend to invoke religion to sanction the present order. So this is their God-given right. God, bless, God intended for them to be, in whatever position that they're in. The idea that as different people have gone over and tried to conquer other people, they felt that they had a mandate from God to go in and conquer people and teach them the right way. And so a lot of different over the centuries, different groups have used the religion and the notion of God as their dictate to go in and oppress other people. And so now, they talk about the use of religion to support injustice, and it can help to explain a pair of things that people have found about North American Christianity. And so now, things that your text talks about North American Christianity, the idea that white church members express more racial prejudice than non-members. So the idea that if you're a white church member, you're more likely to endorse racial prejudice than if you're a white person who doesn't go to church. The idea that those professing traditional and fundamental Christian beliefs tended to express more prejudice than those professing more progressive beliefs. So to me, as I read that gave me some cause for concern. So when you kind of think about the idea that people who claim to be religious also claim the most amount of prejudice. And so it can draw you to make some conclusion about religion, to say that, well, maybe religion is really promoting a lot of the prejudice and a lot of the problems that we're having in society. But now, I guess I want to encourage you to kind of think about the rest of the story. What's the other piece of this that we need to make sure we're aware of? So when they look at religion and prejudice, they found that people who were regular churchgoers tended to be less prejudiced. So very different from those those first numbers. The other part is that people who were considered to be devout Christians tended to be less prejudiced than other people. When you look back through history, you'll notice that like during the Civil Rights Movement, a lot of the leaders were ministers and Catholic priests who were very active and actively involved in civil rights movement, promoting equality. Also, when you looking back with the Holocaust and the Nazis, you'll notice that there were religious leaders who actually stood up against the Nazis' influence on the German Protestant church. So, you can see that some religious groups and some faith-based organizations or religious people have actually been very vocal through the ages about treating people equally or about valuing diversity. And so, there's they comment on one thing about the Christian faith or different religious faiths that stood out. And the book lists it, but it doesn't. I don't think it tells you exactly where it comes from. But if you go to the Bible in Mark 12:30 and 31, it says, "And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this: you should love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. And so, from this perspective about Christianity or religion, the notion that we're going to love other people. And so, part of what your text points out is that people who are actually buy into this notion of love and other people as themselves tend to be less likely to be prejudiced, or to be less prejudicial. And so when you look at people and look at religion and the association between religion and prejudice, the people who endorse such religious values, such as the idea of loving your neighbor as yourself, tend to be less prejudicial. But people who tend to endorse faith or go to church as more of a status symbol, as fulfilling other needs or other motives, tend to be the ones who are more likely to be prejudicial. So it gives you a little bit more to think about what's the role of religion in endorsing prejudicial behavior. So the other part of socialization is the idea about conformity. So if prejudice is socially accepted, many people will follow the path of least resistance and conform to that fashion about being prejudiced. Also, if prejudice is not deeply ingrained in your personality, then as fashions change and new norms evolve, prejudice can also be diminished. So the idea that you have some people that it's not like they really feel passionately about being prejudiced, they're just kind of going with the flow. And so those same people who don't have these really strong feelings about prejudice, as we change the culture, as we change what's fashionable, that they are going to be more likely to buy into a less prejudicial or more accepting perspective. And so that could be good news if we're trying to help change some of that behavior. So now, as we continue to look at what are some of the sources of prejudice, there is an issue of institutional supports. And so we can see how issues like the government can be said to promote or to maintain prejudice. And so part of that, when you think about some of the social policies that may be in place that will maintain the status quo, and if you consider that the status quo in many cases seems to be biased against different groups of people, then you could say that the government, or that aspect of the government, is actually contributing to prejudice. The other thing you can think about is schools. Well, when you look in the school systems, you'll notice that sometimes by the books that they choose, by the stories that they have children to read and to learn, that there can be things in those that can be prejudicial. And so you can kind of think about maybe a textbook that a kid may read where they have a male and female, and the guy is going to come in and help the female because she's having a hard time, and she's a female and she can't quite get it, and so she just needs a little help. And so by reading this story, the intention may be to teach people about helping other people and about citizenship. But if you're constantly portraying the female as this weak and helpless and basically inadequate or ineffectual person who has to be saved or rescued or helped by a male, then you're perpetuating some stereotypes against females. And so in that case, schools can be continuing and perpetuating some of this prejudicial thoughts and the stereotypic behavior. The other things you can think about that supports this whole process can be magazines and newspapers. And so there's the concept of facism. So the idea that when you see pictures of men in magazines and newspapers, there tends to be this focus on the face. But when you see these pictures of the females, there tends to be the focus on the body. And so the idea of you kind of think about the face, the head being the intellect, and the female being the body. And so it focuses more on her sexuality. And so when you kind of put those together, the idea that the man is going to contribute the face, the head, the intellect, the power, and the female biggest thing to offer is her body or her sexuality. And so again, it's going to be perpetuated some really negative stereotypes about females. So now other institutions that tend to support or reinforce some of the prejudice, they talk about film and television. Both tend to perpetuate a lot of stereotypes. And so a good example could be things like rap videos. So you have these rap videos that may portray different minority groups or especially or economically disadvantaged groups as being very promiscuous and being very violent. And so you have that portrayal out there going into everybody. And then you may have that economically disadvantaged teen who may be involved with teen pregnancy. And so the idea that you see these portrayals of these teens as being out there just being promiscuous and kind of being wild or sowing their wild oats or however you think of that. And then the idea that, okay, now they went out and they made some bad choices and they were living it up, and now they're back and want the system to help them take care of this child that they've created. And so part of that, the stereotyping that can come out of those videos can lead people to be more reluctant to give help that's needed to these different populations, because based on things like the way it's portrayed in the media, people have some very negative impressions and make some very negative attributions about the behavior that led to the conception of this child. And so in that way, you can see how some of these videos and stuff are really perpetuating some stereotypes that you may have, and can really work against the person when it comes to getting services. So now, one of the things that it becomes important to look at is what are the motivating sources for prejudice? And one approach talks about frustration and aggression. And there's an idea about a scapegoat theory. And so the whole idea is that we're out there trying to pursue a goal and something blocks us from that goal. And being blocked from achieving our goal is going to create a certain amount of frustration. And then we have that whole issue about displacing that anger, and aggression that comes out of the frustration. So we can't lash out at what's really making us mad, what's really blocking our goal. So we find something that's an acceptable target, something that tends to be less powerful than we are, something that's less likely to be able to get us back. So the idea about displacement, we find someone or something that's helpless and we take it out on them. And so one example of that's been attributed to this displacement is the notion of hate crimes. And so there's research that looks at during times when groups are experiencing different economic hardships, that there tends to be an increase in some of the hate crimes, because again, people see that these other groups as being somehow like depriving them of privileges or preventing them from being successful, and so they lash out. So people may feel like, when the unemployment and stuff is high, and they're being blocked from pursuing different economic advantages or just providing for their families, and so they may turn around and lash out at whoever they're considering to be the more powerless group, and so they may engage in some type of hate crime geared toward that group of people. So now, the other way to describe it is a realistic group conflict theory. And so it says that prejudice comes when groups have to compete for limited resources. And so again, there's that perception that resources are limited, so we basically got to fight it out for it. And so again, when you kind of think about a lot of the drama, a lot of the attention about undocumented workers, or undocumented immigrants. The idea that these undocumented immigrants are coming in and taking the jobs from the Americans. And so in situations where unemployment tends to be high, then that heightened aggression tends to evolve, and that can turn into some very negative interactions, maybe even some of the hate crime things, some of the propaganda against immigrants. Because, again, they feel like there's a limited number of jobs, and we're having to compete against people coming in from other countries who don't, who in some cases are going to work for less money. It's, because the whole idea about being undocumented opens them up to being exploited more by potential employers who can hire them, who can pay them less than what they would have to pay minimum wage. And so again, the idea that you got people coming in who are going to take the job or under kind of undercut them on salaries on the jobs, and so people have this tension, they have this aggression, and they lash out against these groups who end up being exploited and abused on multiple levels, because especially if they're undocumented, their status can make them more vulnerable to being exploited. So now there's something called a social identity theory, and it talks about people feeling superior to other people. So they talk about the we aspect of our self-concept, the part of our answer to who am I that comes from our group membership. So the idea that part of the value we associate with ourselves comes from the fact that we're part of a group that we value. And so that's part of our social identity. And so what social identity theories would say that we tend to categorize people, and we categorize ourselves. And then once we do that, we go to and identify a group that we will choose to associate with. And that group that we choose to associate with becomes the in group. They're the category that we see ourselves as. And then as we create this in group, we start to compare ourselves against this out group, this other group. And the idea that we as an in group are going to be somehow better than the other group. So when we think about in group bias, there's a tendency to favor our own group over other groups. And because of our social identification, we tend to conform to our group norms. Because again, part of our value is the value of being a member of this special group. And then when our group succeeds, we feel better by identifying strongly with our group. Because if our group is successful, then we're successful. So we have value. So that whole idea, the issue of our social identity tends to be more elevated because we're part of a good group, so that makes us good. So now, also part of this whole social identity theory is the idea that there's a need for status or self-regard and belonging. And so they talk about something called terror management. So people's self-protective emotional and cognitive responses when they're confronted with reminders of their mortality is what happens in this whole idea about terror management. And so this fear prompts people to enact legislation and support causes because they're afraid of what this out group is going to do, to hurt them or to get to them. And so in some cases of sexism, you have the idea about putting a woman down or putting her in her place or keeping her in her place helps a man to feel more manly, to feel more important, to feel, more that he's more of a man if he can put this woman down and put her in her place. So the idea about this terror management is that if our group can come together to fight against some other group out there, that some out group, then it's going to make us stronger as a group. Just that coming together with one enemy helps solidify our group and make us even stronger, make us more closely aligned with our group. And the idea again is that when we get our identity from this group, when we get our value from this group, that we're going to work harder to conform to the norms and the wishes of this group. So, of the motivational sources of prejudice, we can think about motivation to avoid prejudice. And so, for some people, that motivation to avoid prejudice can lead them to modify their thoughts and their actions. So, you may have self-conscious people who feel guilt and try to inhibit their prejudice responses. And so, these people tend to have some kind of internal motivation to change their prejudice. And when you are internally motivated to change any prejudicial thoughts or attitudes that you have, then you tend to be more successful because you are internally motivated. I'm not just doing it for you out there to please anybody. I'm not just doing it because that's what the fad of the day is. I'm doing it because I actually believe that that's important. And so I believe that it's important for me to value other people. And so it's going to help me to be more motivated to change any stereotypic thoughts that I have about other people. So now, as we think about the cognitive sources of prejudice, we can think about categorization. So again, the idea about we're classifying people into groups. And so we do a certain amount of spontaneous categorization. And that actually serves a purpose. And so the idea that when we tend to be pressed for time, when we tend to be preoccupied, we're tired, when we're emotionally aroused, or we fail to appreciate diversity, those are going to be some of those times when we're going to tend to do this spontaneous categorization. Now, social identity theory implies that those who feel their social identity keenly will concern themselves with correctly characterizing people as us and them. So now, put another way, if my social identity is important to me, remember, I'm going to be part of this group. I'm going to get my value from this group. I'm going to look up to this group. I'm going to follow the norms of this group. And so now, if that's important to me, then it's going to be really important for me to know who's my group and who's not my group. Because again, I'm agreeing strongly with my group, and my value, my sense of worth or importance is by virtue of being in that group. So I don't need to know who they are. And so it serves a function. It can be a positive thing, but the idea that when it comes to prejudice, that it can be very detrimental. And so part of prejudice is that you have to kind of categorize people, us and them. And so from this categorization can develop into the prejudice that we see. And so now, as we categorize people into groups, we're going to keep in mind some of the perceived similarities and differences. So there's an outgroup homogeneity effect. The perception that outgroup members are more similar to one another than our in-group members. They're all alike. So they talk about the own race bias. So a tendency for people to more accurately recognize faces of their own race. So, sometimes the idea with prejudice, people say, well, you know what? You know how them black folks are, they all look alike. Well, for some people who are in the out group, who aren't part of that group, to them, we may all look alike. To us, we look very different. And as people interact with people from various groups, we tend to see the differences in those groups. But when we tend to be isolated and we don't interact much with those groups, then it's easier for them to all to look alike and to be lumped together and to be treated the same, or to be discriminated against the same, to be devalued against the same. So again, the idea that we make this outgroup homogeneity effect, this misperception or this bias to think that they're all the same, when we know that there is as much variation within groups as there is between groups. So as you kind of go and you kind of think about distinctiveness and the idea about perceiving people who stand out, and distinctive people tends to feed on self-consciousness. So if you're distinctive, if you stand out in the crowd, if you're in a group and you're the only one who's like you, at some point it can kind of make you feel a little self-conscious about being the only one. And so it can lead people to make some misattributions or to misinterpret some of the behaviors of others. So, if you're the only one of your group in a crowd and then something negative happens to you, then there can be a tendency to say, yep, y'all did that just because I'm whatever group I'm a member of. When really it may not have anything to do with the group that you're a member of. It could be because of something else, some other variable that causes the interaction that you're experiencing. And so sometimes people who are in these distinctive groups, or who are the only one of whatever group they are, tend to make the mistake of falling back on that uniqueness as being the problem, when as being the source of the negative treatment, when it may be something else. So you'll have someone who gets a bad grade, and it's like, okay, it's because I'm the only one of my group in this class, and so the teacher just gave me a bad grade because they didn't like me. When really it may be that you just didn't study as well as you could have, and your grade was low. And so there's also the idea about stigma consciousness. So the person's expectation about being victimized by prejudice or by discrimination tends to influence them. So if I expect to be mistreated because I'm black, I'm a black female, and so that people are going to pick on me, then it's going to make me stressful because I'm going to expect people to discriminate. And then so that can be a problem, because again, there may be situations where I just did a crappy job, I got called on it, and it wasn't because I was black, but it's because I didn't do a good job. And so, to understand and to anticipate that. So not always to expect that we're going to be discriminated against or treated badly. Now, the other issue, though, about that whole idea about the stigma, stigma consciousness, is that if you have that expectation, and then when people do treat you unfairly, you can say, hey, you know what? It's not me. I know that I'm not going to take that personal, because, they are just messed up. They just have a problem. They're just racist or prejudiced. But that's not about me, because that doesn't take away my value as a person. So in that case, it can actually be a buffer for your self-esteem, so that when people do act out, it doesn't hurt you, or it's not as detrimental to you than otherwise. So again, the idea about with this distinctiveness, you also have the issue of vivid cases. So when you have limited experience with a particular social group, we tend to recall examples of it and to generalize. And so, when we look at those vivid cases as examples, it can sometimes prime us to see the stereotypes. And so we have to be very mindful of that and be careful about that whole idea about. So you can also look at the fact that distinctive events can foster an illusory correlation. So stereotypes assumes a correlation between the group member and individual's presumed characteristics. So let me say that better. So stereotypes assume a correlation between group membership and individuals' presumed characteristics. So there's an attentiveness to unusual occurrences can create this illusory correlation. So we're noticing these unusual occurrences. and we're thinking that there's a correlation between the fact that this person is in a group and they have this unusual characteristic. When again, that may not have anything to do with, or may not be related to the group membership, but it's standing out in our minds. We're paying attention to it. So the idea about attributions. Is this really a just world? And so there's something called a just world phenomenon. So now we talked about attributions, is that when we're going to see someone's behavior and we're going to attribute that behavior to some type of motives or something that we may not see. Excuse me. So there's an idea about a self-serving bias. So with a self-serving bias, or group-serving bias, sorry, with a group-serving bias, we're going to be biased in favor of our group. So when we see somebody in the out group do something that's good or something positive, we're going to try to explain it away. And then we're also going to look at any negative behaviors that they do and attribute it to their disposition. It's not environmentally, it's not about the situation that caused the negative behavior, but it's because they're just a bad person. So again, that's going to be part of the self-serving bias. And then there's the just world phenomena. It says the tendency for people to believe that the world is just and that people get what they deserve. And so now, if you tend to be a higher status person who has different privileges and benefits, you're going to say that, hey, people get what they deserve. I have all of these benefits. I have this status because, I deserve it. And so someone who doesn't have it, by the same logic, they don't deserve these good things. And so, that tends to be a fallacy. I think someone commented on the idea that there was a question about Trump paying taxes or not paying taxes, and the comment, his comment was that if he did pay taxes, it would be because he's smart. Well, the implication there again that it's a just world, so that in a just world, if he's smarter than everybody else, then he should be able to get out of paying taxes that other people pay. And the other part of that is that people who do pay these taxes are just not as smart, so they deserve to pay these taxes. So again, you can see how this whole just world phenomenon can be played out. So now, another thing that we have to consider when we think about the consequences of prejudice is the self-perpetuating prejudgments. So whenever a member of a group behaves as expected, we duly note the fact, and then our prior belief is confirmed. So when we have these stereotypes about what someone is going to do, and then they do it, then that confirms that, hey, that stereotype was right. That prior belief was right. And when a member of a group behaves inconsistently with what we expect, though, we may interpret or explain away the behavior as due to some special circumstances. Because they're somehow different, they stand out, that they're not being the way that they should be. So part of this self-perpetuating judgments can lead to something called subtyping. So you accommodate individuals who deviate from your stereotype by thinking of them as the exceptions to the rule. So the black person who does well on standardized tests, it's not because they're smarter. It's not because they're smart or they have some disposition, something about their personality that makes them special. But what it is that they're just the exception to the rule, because we know that blacks or people of color don't do well on standardized tests. So if you're black or a person of color and you did well on a standardized test, well, you're just special. You're different. You're not like the rest of them. So the idea about subgrouping, accommodating individuals who deviate from one stereotype by forming a new stereotype about this subset of the group. So again, you're finding ways to continue and perpetuate these stereotypes or these prejudgments that you have. So as we think about consequences of discrimination, we can think about discrimination's impact in the form of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the idea that social beliefs can be self-confirming. We've talked about a self-fulfilling prophecy, the idea that you got to tell yourself that this is the way it's going to be, and then your behavior reinforces it so that things actually turn out the way you thought. And so when you think about how racism or how prejudice affects the targets, the people who are being discriminated against, you can see how that it can create for them a self-fulfilling prophecy where they feel bad about themselves, and then that they act in ways that continue to bring these negative consequences to them, or that people can look at it as like, yep, see, I knew they were like that. I'm telling you, that's how they get all of them like that. And so you're maintaining or perpetuating this stereotype or these traditional beliefs about you. And so now, and that's kind of associated with the idea about stereotype threat. So you have this disruptive concerns when facing a negative stereotype, that one will be evaluated based on a negative stereotype. So you have the question about, do stereotypes bias judgments of individuals? Well, the answer is yes, but people often evaluate individuals more positively than the groups they compose. So when you think about biased judgments, we may make some bias or stereotypic judgments about a group of people, but we tend to be more favorable when we deal with a person as an individual. And so there's also the idea that strong stereotypes do tend to matter, and they tend to be more pervasive. So that when we have some of the stereotypes and some of the prejudice, that you can see it influencing multiple people in multiple areas. And stereotypes bias our interpretations, affect how events are interpreted. We evaluate people more extremely when their behavior violates our stereotypes. And that's all. Have a good one.